Officially, Pope Francis has told us we need to read more books. Welcome to Intermerifica, New Mexico, the channel where we look at things of wonder from the perspectives of faith and reason, philosophy and theology. I'm your host, Daniel Kelly. And today what we're going to be talking about is about a month ago, a little over a month ago, Pope Francis released a letter that I think has kind of flown under the radar and not been talked about enough. And that's what I want to talk about. It's about literature, one of the great wonders in our lives that we examine as literature. And so he had a lot of really great things to say, and if you missed it or if you wanted to dig more deeply into it, that's what we're going to be doing. It's titled with the interesting title, Pastoral Letter on the Role of Literature in Formation. So kind of clunky. I like when papal documents, and they don't do this for letters usually, but have the nice pithy Latin names, because this one's kind of clunky. So Pope Francis was going to write this originally for priestly formation. He thinks that priests aren't being formed well enough by reading poetry and literature. But as he wrote it, he realized that it would actually help anybody that's engaged in pastoral work to be able to engage better in that and to form. It's on formation. It's one of the main ways that we form is through literature, that we form our hearts. And then he said, well, actually, all Christians could be helped by these reflections on forming ourselves through literature and how it helps us to reach personal maturity. So I think that's really, really cool. And this kind of stands in the this isn't anything new that he's talking about, right? In Gaudium et Spes and Communio et Progressio, they talked about how we need to develop all the parts of the human person and how the arts do that. And someday I'll make a video just on those documents showing how we're supposed to be this Renaissance man, this universal man. The church says we're supposed to develop all parts of us. We're not just supposed to be super hyper specialized. And how the arts do that. So Pope Francis is in that tradition from the Vatican Council onward, and he's highlighting literature as this art that can help us in that way to grow to be a full man, that all of us, all parts of us are developed. So it's really cool. So in the beginning he describes that. Then in section 3 he talks about how books, texts, literature are actually like these living documents, and they interact with us in a way that's different from any other audio or visual media, right? When we're reading a book, we get part from the book and it's getting part from us that combines for the product. So one way to think about this is in any good horror movie or one of the rules is you don't show the horror because the person's imagination will make it way worse than you could ever show, and showing it a lot of times ruins it, right? Well, why is that? Because our imaginations are so powerful. So when we have these written words, our imaginations can take that, and what we're reading forms us, but our imagination also forms it, so it's living. We can get more every time we go to it, and it grows too. So, for audiovisual media, a lot of times the medium gets in the way of that, of us being able to interact with it fully in that way. So I thought that was really cool. He talks about in section 4 how literature grants access to the heart of culture, which is born from the heart of individuals, right? So where does culture spring from? Well, we get to that wellspring of culture through the culture's literature, and then that's the same way we get to the heart of individuals. He goes on in 5 and 6, he talks about how literature originates in the core of the person, and then it takes all the resources of human language and puts them at the disposal of the core of the human person. So I just really like that language. It reminds me of how we're built in a Trinitarian manner, right? So like the core, the person from which all being springs is the Father, right? He's the origin of the whole Godhead. But then he gives himself out in his word, Jesus, the second person. In the same way, that's what literature does. It comes from the heart of the human being, but then uses everything about human language, right, the word, we use our words to express the core of the human person. So I think that's really good. Pope Francis then goes on to talk about, he mentions one of his favorite themes throughout this letter is we need to read stuff with an open mind. That reminds me of how both C.S. Lewis and Peter Kreeft, and I'll do a video on this later, how they talk about reading literature. First, you just have to, when you're reading something, you don't first come in as judge and jury, you just have to see for what it is first. And so he's kind of continuing that theme. He mentions his favorite literature is tragedies, which I find interesting. My wife's favorite literature are tragedies. I would say I don't like tragedies, but when I'm looking at the books that are my favorites, I actually have a strong tragedy theme. And I've done a whole video, which I'll put a link in the description, how tragedies do, before he released this letter, how they help form us, form our hearts in virtue. Then he goes in from sections 18 to 13, how literature helps us dialogue with the culture. As Christians, we dialogue with the culture to find the best, right? We test everything and retain what's good. That's what we do with any culture. That's what the church is supposed to purify culture, so that we just hold on to what's good and true and beautiful in that culture. And we need a dialogue with the culture. He quotes Basil of Caesarea, St. Basil of Caesarea, a 4th century guy who said, hey, to form ourselves correctly, we do need to be reading even these pagan authors that are part of our culture. And I think that's really, really important. Pope Francis highlights how even St. Paul in the New Testament quotes from pagan authors. And I think that's just really, really important. A side note on these sections, I have to go in the English translation of his letter that some people have objected to for the dating. It uses BCE, which is just so silly. I think that's the translator, though, not Pope Francis, because I looked at it in the other languages, and they use the equivalent in the Spanish, and they use the equivalent of before Christ, not before current era. So it's just whatever English translator is being silly. It's not a Pope Francis thing, it's the translator. So that's just an aside, because I've seen some people object to that. And that is dumb. I agree that that's dumb, but it's not from Pope Francis. Then he goes on to describe, I think this is really, really important in sections 14 and 15. He describes very powerfully how people are thirsty for God in our culture. They're not thirsty to be atheists. They're not we have a lot of atheism, but they're just so thirsty for God. But then they don't know where to find Him, so they drink other things. And what they're drinking in our modern culture is a sort of Gnosticism that tries to divide the incarnation. Everything's just disembodied, or our bodies are separate from us, right? We can mess around with our bodies, and that's not messing around with us. The body is just kind of a shell or something we play with, that we do fun stuff with. And he says, no, literature helps us to express Jesus in flesh, right? Jesus had emotions. He had all this stuff. That's what we need. We're thirsty for the incarnate God. And Pope Francis describes that just super powerfully. Then he goes on and talks about how science shows the many benefits of reading literature a lot and reading books a lot. And the one part of this that I don't really like, that is a difficulty in a lot of Pope Francis's stuff, is he kind of falls into journalese, that kind of very banal writing that's just not fun to read. And here, especially a lot of times when he talks about science and stuff, he talks like a journalist, and the worst kind of journalistic language. So that's one part that makes reading this a little bit difficult. But he talks about science shows how many benefits reading does, and it's true. He just kind of summarizes that. He shows how literature, I really like this, he shows how literature prepares us for situations that we need to be prepared for, that we're not going to usually encounter more than once, so we already have to be prepared for. So like different tragedies and stuff that we need to already be prepared from, but we can't get prepared through experiencing them a bunch. We need to prepare from through reading about them. Kind of like games do that, prepare us for stuff that we need to be prepared for, like fighting or different things that you can't get good at just doing it, because you usually have one opportunity to do it well. It just comes up once in your life. So he talks about how literature prepares us for those things very well, and I think that's true, and I think it's really good. There's just this really good quote on that he uses in section 18 that I want to read. Novels unleash in us, in the space of an hour, all the possible joys and misfortunes that, In life, it would take us entire years to know, even slightly, and of which the most intense would never be revealed to us because the slowness with which they occur prevents us from perceiving them. I think that's such a good quote, right? So it helps us to appreciate and live life more fully as it's preparing us. So I just think that's really, really good. And then he also goes on to talk about, and this is in section 18, both these quotes, one of his big themes is it helps us to have empathy because it helps us to be inside another person's head. I believe it was Chesterton that said, it was Chesterton or Lewis, who talked about how literature helped us to see through someone else's eyes, be in someone else's head in a way that nothing else can. And I think that's really true. Pope Francis talks about this using this quote. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it's still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself. And I'm never more myself than when I do, right? So it's really cool with all these things, but with literature, we go outside ourselves, we get into places we could never be by ourselves, but that's when we're most ourselves. And that's really, really good. I really like this section. One of the things with like TV or radio or different stuff like that, I think there's too much of the medium that gets in the way. It makes it harder to transcend ourselves in that way. There's just too much stuff, right? Because everybody who sees Iron Man, we're not getting into his head. He's there, an object that we're interacting with, kind of. We're not in his head. But this whole section, I think, is really, really good, section 18. Then he goes on in section 19 to talk to, this is how a theme he brings up over and over, it helps us to listen to the other, right? That's what literature does, and that's how we get to their hearts, and that's our job as Christians, is to speak to the hearts of other people. And how do we do that? Through listening to others, which literature helps us to do that. He highlights, then he goes on in section 22, he highlights T.S. Eliot. I thought this was very interesting. It's one of the most outstanding Christian authors. So if you haven't looked at T.S. Eliot, here's an impetus to do so. He talks about how T.S. Eliot says, our biggest problem today is the inability to be moved by the face of God, by creation, and by other human beings, right? We're not moved by that. We're too focused on our needs and our goals. And he'll talk about this more later on, but we're too focused on these things, so we don't have time to just be like, wow, God's amazing. Wow, this person in front of me is amazing. We just look at how can this person serve me? How can this person help me get to my goals? And the same with creation. That's why we abuse creation. And I think that's this section 22 is just so powerful, really, really important. Then sections 23 to 29, he focuses especially on the formation of priests. I'm not going to get into that too much. If you're a priest, go read that part, or if you're in formation to be a priest. One of the things I do have to bring up is he quotes Karl Rahner a lot, and obviously that's a difficult theologian, but just because he's difficult doesn't mean he doesn't have good things to say, and he does have good things to say. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, oh, just because this guy had some difficult ideas, we don't want anything to do with him. And that's kind of the thing when we interact with any culture. It's the same theme. Just like we don't want to throw out a whole culture because it has bad parts, well, same thing with a person's ideas. So in this section for priests, he talks about the theme. He has this theme of nostalgia, right? Nostalgia, that ache for home, of returning, right? That we get this pain. That's what it means. Nostalgia means this homecoming pain, this pain of returning. And it reminds me of how C.S. Lewis talks about that joy, that longing that different things bring up to us, that it's almost like pain, but it's so joyful, and just this desire for something else, for our true homeland, right, that comes up in different stuff is just so powerful. And he says, Pope Francis, I think this is really amazing. All human words, he's talking about this stuff that brings up this nostalgia, what C.S. Lewis would call joy. All human words bear traces of an intrinsic longing for God, right? So the Word was made flesh, and all our human words bear some trace of the divine word. That's so important. All human words bear traces of that longing for God. So in a way, when we're evangelizing and different stuff, the deck is stacked in our favor. Every word all human language comes from the word of God, which is Jesus Christ. That's really important. In section 29, he gives a kind of lengthy examination of how to discern using literature. And he uses this kind of interesting construction where we're read by what we read. What he means is when we're reading prayerfully and considering everything really well, we can see what parts we understand ourselves better, because we're seeing, is this part being difficult for me? Am I enjoying this part? Is this something that's evil that I shouldn't be liking, but I am? Am I having difficulty with this part, right? So when we're reading something, it opens ourselves. We're read by what we're reading. And I think that is a really important part of discernment. Then he tells us, again, we've talked about this a little in section 30, literature helps us to experience life as it actually is, to see life for what it really is. Otherwise, our life, if we don't go out of ourselves, transcend ourselves in that way, life can be kind of narrowed. He talks about in section 31 how we're shaped too much by our short-term goals, right? This utilitarianism. We're under that work-a-day umbrella, as Joseph Pfeiffer would say, right? Where we're just focused on what do I have to, the grind. We're just focused on the grind, and we never take back leisure and do stuff that's just good for its own sake. It's not getting me any utility. It's just good for its own sake. That's the most freeing thing. And he talks about in section 32, this is the way we need to welcome reality, not just look at reality as a thing to get stuff out of. We just need to be there and take time to welcome reality. And literature is what helps us to do this in a very real way. Right? This leisure and this freedom characterize the approach to reality where we welcome it. Right? So when we're just not trying to get anything, we're just enjoying reality, welcoming it, that's where freedom and leisure come from. And literature, although not the only way to do this welcoming of reality, does, he says, hold pride of place in welcoming reality in this way. And then he goes into this really intense metaphor that I'm not going to go through, how we go deeper into life through literature. And he has this analogy where we ruminate, we're chewing our cud when we're reading, we're digesting life and experience through reading, and that's really important. Then he returns to his theme of seeing through the eyes of others through sections 34 through 40. And empathy, we learn that we're not alone in our experiences. Even if we're completely alone, we know if we've read, people have experienced these same emotions, these same things, so we're not alone. We're part of humanity, we're part of that big family, and humanity is kind of behind us when we're experiencing these things, even when we're on our own. He uses a lot of really good imagery to describe this that just echoes in our hearts. He describes like how you can empathize with this in literature, this weeping, abandoned girl, and your heart just goes out to her just from that description. And he gives all kinds of descriptions like that, like widows, different stuff, and your heart immediately responds, and that's why it helps us grow in empathy. In sections 38 through 39, he talks about how judgments are needed and values are needed in reading. We can't just be relativistic. He says relativism has no part in reading literature. So to be able to listen, we need judgment. To be able to listen to what's really going on, we have to have some standard to compare it against, right? It reminds me of like iron sharpens iron. So if we have this standard of judgment and the iron of the literature comes, they sharpen each other. Jello doesn't sharpen Jello, right? If you just put it together, they don't change each other. So we need that judgment, but then he talks about how we need that, but we can't just try to put everything in boxes. Not everything always fits into boxes, right? Then he goes into some really more journalese stuff. Don't want to get into it, but banal language. But then he talks about in section 42, where I really like, is literature topples the idol of the self, right? And when we're just the measure of all things, when we read more and go into the other people's worlds, it kind of gets rid of that idol of the self, and it's really good. That's a really good section. The final part I want to talk about in section 43, he says this is where, and he's talking about priests especially, but all Christians, we get this ability, like Adam did, to name things. Literature helps us with this, but we're supposed to bestow meaning. We're supposed to say what the meaning is in stuff, naming it, right? What's the significance of this event in my life? What's the significance of this thing I'm reading? What's the significance of what's going on, right? We bestow that meaning like Adam did. We don't just arbitrarily say, oh, this is going to be this meaningful way, but we recognize its intrinsic character and we bestow the meaning like Adam did when he saw a lion and said, that's kind of a lion-y thing, I call it lion. Well, we do that with our experiences, and literature helps us do it, that when we name our experiences, this is the significance of it. This is the significance of this part of reality. And so that's really powerful. We're priests of creation. We're supposed to do what Adam did, naming everything in creation, our experiences, every part of creation. So I think that's really powerful. So that's kind of in a nutshell Pope Francis's letter on literature. I hope it was helpful to you. If you have a chance, go dig more deeply into it. It's super powerful. And basically we need to grow, to fully develop, be personally mature, and to form ourselves correctly, we need to be looking at poems, novels, literature, and we need to find great literature and read it. And I think that's just so important. And I'm really, really happy Pope Francis emphasized this, and I'm and will hopefully dig more into this as in later videos and as we go on. So I hope that was helpful to you. You have a good day. God bless you.